you so much for joining us today from your homes and offices and virtually. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk about RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. It is a pleasure to have such experienced professionals to discuss this rather complex subject. This is a very timely conversation, as I know all of our panelists are currently focused on the sixth RHNA cycle process, which promises to result in higher housing allocations than perhaps we have ever seen, and why we came up with the cute workshop title of RHNA, Ready or Not, Housing Numbers Arrive. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of the panelists in presentations, as well as having an opportunity to ask questions. Typically at our in-person conference, we have an audience with a Q&A session, but I or we will have to serve as our audience today and ask some good questions later. Let me take a brief moment to introduce myself and do some introduction of the panelists. I am Olivia Marr. I am the president of the Coastal Housing Coalition, and I have sat on the board for approximately 5 years. I am also a land use and real estate attorney here in town at Fauver Large Archibald Spray. We have 4 amazing panelists on this topic. Dan Clement is Deputy Director of Long Range Planning for Santa Barbara County Planning and Development Department. He has worked for over 20 years as a planner in both the public and private sector, including on numerous housing-related projects and programs. Dan is actively involved in housing needs allocation process for Santa Barbara County currently. We also have Dan Gullett, and so we don't get confused later, I'll be referring to Dan Clement as DK and Dan Gullett as Dan. Dan has been with the City of Santa Barbara for 13 years in various roles, but is currently a principal planner and oversees the city's long-range planning and special studies. I noted in Dan's bio that he has a BA in biophysics, and honestly, I had to look up what that meant, and I'm impressed. And we'll have to talk about later what moved Dan from biophysics to planning, but that's for another day. I'd also like to welcome Paavo Monkonen. We are so fortunate to have him join us in this discussion. Paavo is our one non-local panelist and brings with that a unique perspective. Paavo is currently the Vice Chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. In his role, Paavo also serves as the Director of the Latin American Cities Initiative, the Coordinator of the Regional International Development Concentration, and a faculty cluster leader for the Global Public Affairs Initiative. Paavo is busy. Paavo researches and writes on the ways policies and markets shape urbanization and social segregation in cities around the world. It was Paavo's various writings and articles regarding RHNA that brought him to the Coastal Housing Coalition's attention, and again, we are just so pleased to have him with us for this discussion. Lastly, I want to introduce our first presenter, Michael Becker. Mike is the Director of Planning at the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, SBCAG, where he is not only responsible for the Regional Transportation Plan, but also, coincidentally, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. Mike has been a consistent supporter and contributor to our housing conferences over the years, and I personally appreciate your participation again. Welcome to you all, and Mike, when you are ready, I'm looking forward to your overview of RHNA and learning about the current sixth cycle process.
Thank you for the introduction, Olivia. This conference has always been one of my favorites, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I am Mike Becker, Director of Planning for the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, or SBCAG. SBCAG serves a variety of roles in the region, and the common theme among those roles is they typically involve issues that cross political boundaries. RHNA is one of the roles that SBCAG fills. Through my talk, I'll provide an overview of RHNA, what it is and what purpose it serves, discuss where we are and where we're heading in navigating the sixth cycle of RHNA. I'll talk about our draft RHNA determination, and finally, I'll touch on some of the recent changes in law that put some teeth into RHNA. RHNA is the acronym for Ready or Not Housing Numbers Arrive. Well, it might as well be. RHNA, in its acronym form, has gained supremacy over its full name of Regional Housing Needs Allocation. At its core, RHNA is the state's fair share housing law. It ensures, at least on paper, that every jurisdiction in the state plans to accommodate a minimum number of housing units. In addition, that minimum number that each jurisdiction must plan to accommodate is stratified across 4 income levels. By my view of the intent of RHNA, it should limit cities from becoming wealthy enclaves or from taking no growth stances, though I won't claim what I view as the intent and practice align. RHNA was created by the Housing Element Act of 1969. However, RHNA in its current form has been around since the early 1980s. This sixth cycle that we were soon entering notes the sixth cycle since those legal changes of the early 1980s. RHNA provides rules for three layers of governments: the state, regional agencies such as SBCAG, and local agencies or local governments such as cities and county government. The state, led by its Department of Housing and Community Development, carries out the state's housing law. What I feel is their biggest role is determining the housing need for each region, or that number that comes that we all must plan to accommodate. The state also reviews of the work of SBCAG, and in the end, it'll review the work of each local government. SBCAG's primary role is to develop a methodology to allocate the regional number across the region. Finally, the local government's role is to plan to accommodate that number through their housing elements. RHNA focuses on the planning aspect. Private developers are necessary to turn plan units into actual units. However, there are exceptions, such as housing developed by housing authorities. The slide on your screen shows housing production through roughly 2/3 of the 5th cycle of RHNA. We are currently in the 5th cycle, and it extends out till 2023. And it shows it purely in percentage of the allocation. The column furthest to the right shows the region-wide percentage is 41%. Though there are only 2 jurisdictions below it, the cities of Santa Barbara and Lompoc, the allocation put a lot of focus on jobs, which in turn provided large numbers for the cities of Santa Barbara and Santa Maria. Santa Maria is marginally ahead of the region-wide average. In summary, just because it is planned doesn't translate to being built. Next slide. This slide shows housing production for the polar ends of the income stratification: very low income and above moderate income. Note that I had to pull Guadalupe out of the chart because the numbers were very high, and it makes the chart unreadable and skewed. Guadalupe far exceeded on both in the very low and above moderate. The point that I wanted to make with this slide is that only 1 of 9 jurisdictions in the region has satisfied the very low income RHNA number. However, 6 of 9 have satisfied the above moderate RHNA number. The above moderate could be considered the market rate housing. Okay, now let me turn to SBCAG's current 6th cycle process. Let me start with a couple of dates: February 2021 and August 2021. By law, 2 things are required to happen by February 2021. First, Housing and Community Development is required to issue its final regional determination, which is the number. And 2, SBCAG is required to have developed a methodology for allocating its regional determination. While these 2 things are clearly related, they can run on independent paths. August 2021 is when SBCAG is required to adopt the 6th cycle RHNA plan. We are currently working on both the items that are due in February. We have received a draft determination from Housing and Community Development. We are in the consultation process. Essentially, we're sharing data sources, checking each other's work, and ensuring that the law is applied appropriately. I should note that the formula used by the state in calculating the regional determination is defined by law, so subjectivity is minimal, if at all. Since this past February, we have been meeting periodically with the region's community development directors or their appointees to discuss options for methodology or the formula to allocate the regional number. There are 5 objectives of RHNA defined in law that the methodology must satisfy. so the flexibility afforded to regions is not without limits. SPCAG is also in the process of developing its next regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy. We were required to show consistency between that planning effort and RHNA. For that purpose, we are working ahead of schedule. Though we still expect to adopt everything in August 2021, we are ahead of schedule because the regional transportation plan requires us to drive the process a little bit faster. And that's why we are currently in the process of developing methodology and in the consultation process with housing community development. By the end of the year, we will enter the environmental phase of for the regional transportation plan sustainable community strategy. So essentially all the big questions need to be answered by then. Here you see the determinations for the Santa Barbara County region back through the early 1980s. The off-color bar to the right is our current draft determination of 29,313 units. Perhaps you notice it's quite a bit bigger than anything that preceded it. You're right. About the same time that Senator Wiener was the keynote speaker of this conference, he was also pushing a bill, Senate Bill 828, which changed RHNA. Senate Bill 828 added 2 new factors into the way the state determines the number, which are overcrowding and cost burden. In addition, SB 828 changed a 3rd factor, the vacancy rate. If you isolate the number that results solely from Senate Bill 828, that number is roughly 16,000 units, or well over half of our draft determination. Since not all RHNA cycles have been equal in terms of years covered, this slide shows the RHNA number on an annualized basis. Had the state not taken its foot off the gas, it appears that the draft number we received would have been expected. Essentially, if you lay a line across the top of the bars. A triangle is created in the void between roughly the 92 cycle and the 2021 numbers. This triangle essentially could be viewed as a state's role through RHNA in creating the crisis that we currently find ourselves in. This is my last slide, and I just wanted to highlight one point with it. The graph shows the allocation to each jurisdiction through the past RHNA cycles. I added a red line on the bar splitting North County and South Coast, though it is not perfectly clean because the unincorporated county straddles both, and here it is included in the North County split. The point I want to make is the further back you go, the bigger the number was being assigned to the North County jurisdictions. Prior to the 2008 cycle, RHNA was playing a role in creating the jobs housing imbalance. Beginning with the 2008 cycle, jobs started to become a major component of the allocation formula. It can be viewed as RHNA attempting to correct the jobs housing imbalance. I know you want to hear from the other folks, so I just want to highlight a few of the laws that are changing RHNA. First, Senate Bill 828, which directly affects how the region-wide number is calculated, and I've already touched on that a bit. Second, Senate Bill 35, that was also a Senator Wiener bill. Senate Bill 35 requires the approval of housing projects meeting certain standards for jurisdictions not satisfying the RHNA numbers. Currently, 29 local governments in California are exempt from Senate Bill 35 due to meeting the RHNA numbers. 3 of them are in Santa Barbara County: Guadalupe, Carpinteria, and Solvang. And the final law, Senate Bill 166. This one is not a Senator Wiener bill. Senate Bill 166 requires housing elements to remain in compliance. Essentially, if a housing element says that 50 units can go to a particular site, and then a project is approved with 25 units on that site, unless there is a surplus built into the housing element somewhere else, more capacity needs to be added to maintain in compliance. And one quick plug before I move on. If you're interested in following SPCAG's RHNA process, visit spcag.org/RHNA for all the documents related to the Sixth Cycle process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was great, really informative. And next, we're going to hear from Dan Gullett from the City of Santa Barbara.
Hi, I want to thank Coastal Housing Coalition for having me again this year. I've always enjoyed this conference and I'm honored to be a part of it again. I'm here to talk about the City of Santa Barbara's perspective on RHNA Cycle 6. And with that, I want to give a bunch of context from the city's viewpoint. As good planners do, we start with a general plan. So to give an idea of the city's position and attitude on housing, the general plan vision is to allow as much housing as possible within resource limits to provide an array of lifestyle options for a demographically and economically diverse resident population. And that's from 2011. Building on that, the land use element and housing elements have maybe 15 policies related to producing more housing. And the general policy is to encourage rental housing close to transit and easy walking and or biking distance to commercial services and recreational opportunities through smaller unit sizes. It's essentially smart growth, and we're wanting to concentrate development downtown. So our current general plan points to a jobs housing balance in the city, and this is consistent with what the region's approach has been to RHNA in recent times. This hasn't always been the case, though. The city has an interesting relationship between housing and jobs. In 1974, the community produced a document called The Impacts of Growth. It's notable this was produced in the middle of the environmental movement. We were seeing bad air quality. There was a lot of development all around and concerns that of resource scarcity. So a year following that, there was a major zoning ordinance amendment that reduced the potential build out of the city substantially. And that loosened over time. Another interesting period in 1989, the voters approved Measure E. What Measure E did was to reduce the potential for non-residential growth in the city. So this is getting at the job side of the jobs housing balance. And I don't know of any other cities that have done that. So that was approved in 1989. That was approved for 20 years. And the city re-upped that thinking with the growth management program in 2010. And what that did was look very carefully at transportation and concentrating new non-residential growth in the downtown. And in 2013, the city adopted, it's called the AUD program on the slide, but it's the Average Unit Size Density Incentive Program, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Before, I'd like to talk about what we have on the ground now. So the city's housing stock. Next slide. I've got a lot of numbers in this presentation, and I hope to just point to larger trends in the numbers. So there's a few tables coming. I don't want to get into the weeds, but I want to point to the weeds. So this table is in the 2015 housing element. This is our current housing element. And this is showing what units City of Santa Barbara and County of Santa Barbara had on the ground then. And I do have updated numbers for 2010 to 2019. It's about 1,300 units. So it's just under 4% for that period too. So what you see in here is a big slowdown in production over time. The city has substantial housing units that are older. So 80-some% of our units were built before 1980. And what's notable about that is that we build these units and they're around for a long time. So we typically expect a building to be around for 75, 100 years. What's also notable about that is these are in prime locations of the city. So once these buildings go up, they're there, and they're not replaced for a while. Also, it's notable that there was a lot of growth in the 80s and before, and much of this was because of the physical growth of the city, annexations. So most of these units are not infill units. They're not replacing other units. And that is something that we need to keep in mind about development potential moving forward and strategies moving forward. So the 2015 housing element that we're currently operating under was produced in response to Cycle 5 of RHNA. So I mentioned the average unit size density incentive program before. The city, in anticipation of the Cycle 5 allocations and knowing what was coming, recognized the need to increase development potential with our zoning. So that was part of the reason why the city brought forward this average unit size density incentive program. What that did was to loosen some zoning restrictions, including higher densities. So the densities increased almost 3 times what was allowed prior to this in some parts of the city. And the way that works is that the smaller average unit size, the more units you can get. This program also reduced parking in half in some places, reduced setbacks and open space standards. And this is a map of where that program applies. All the colored areas are the average unit size density incentive program. And the box in the upper right shows what the densities are allowed in certain areas. So it's up to 63 units an acre in the hatched area. And this is what we got as of May of this year from the average unit size density incentive program. I'll just point out a couple of numbers here. So the total number, 859 units, that includes everything that ever applied. So we know much of these don't get built, but this is what has come across our planning counter. More notable at this point is certificate of occupancy, which is to the left of that. So 277 units have gotten C of O through this program from 2013 to 2020. And also the bottom line is affordable housing units. So 115 units have gotten C of O, 247 units have been approved. Those are mainly people self-help housing and the good work of the housing authority. So this table shows what the city's RHNA allocation was in Cycle 5. And in the bottom right-hand corner is the total number, 4,100 units through 2022. So starting in 2015. Moving to the left, the total units to date, 1,288. So we're building at a rate around 250 units a year. Well, not building. This includes issued and applied for units as well. And moving up that column above 1,288, this is showing how it breaks down per affordability. So on the far right column is showing what our RHNA allocation was. And there's quite a disparity between what we produced and what our allocation was for these affordable units. I'll note the moderate, we produced 4, like by the end of last year. and 820 total was asked of us during the planning period. So the City Council did approve an inclusionary housing ordinance that requires 10% of units to be at moderate. So we've gotten, I believe, 31 additional units, and that was just approved last year. Yeah, so Cycle 6, as we've heard from Mike Becker, is a substantially bigger ask from the state. And then I asked, are these goals from the state remotely achievable? So from the numbers we're seeing, essentially we would need to be increasing annual housing production by 4 times to meet those numbers that the state's giving us, and also increase like the total number of units in the city by 25% in 8 years. So that's the equivalent of building again all of the units we've built back into the 70s. And we also don't have a funding mechanism, a really good funding mechanism for affordable housing right now. And we're asked to provide more affordable housing, and we're not achieving the numbers of affordable housing that we have right now. So the city is committed to providing housing and affordable housing, and we are taking a different approach. It's actually an approach that's addressed in the city's general plan. We've had discussions with the Planning Commission and got direction from City Council to pursue this. So the approach would be to stop regulating density and regulate building size instead. And that the mechanism is floor area to lot area ratio. So you get a bigger building with a bigger lot. And the great thing about that is we can allow for even bigger buildings with affordability. So it's essentially a local density bonus program that'll be simple to understand and simple to administrate. We're also receiving a grant for objective design standards. So we'll be producing objective design standards for multi-unit development to simplify review, provide clear expectation to applicants. So these two things coupled together is essentially a form-based code. Something that just became effective this month, we removed residential parking requirements in the downtown area. So again, it's removing barriers. What we're wanting to do is really encourage units downtown, and also with existing buildings. So existing buildings that are underutilized, that are non-residential, fill them with units. And we're going to loosen zoning requirements around that. And also just for RHNA accounting purposes, we're going to look at state mandated accessory dwelling units. These are newly required by the state, but it does provide substantial zoning capacity for the city. Now to talk about some shortcomings of RHNA. So I see room for improvement with RHNA. The title's cumbersome, opaque, and imprecise, and I'll get into that. Right now it's administered through SBCAG. People don't know what SBCAG is. Like even SBCAG is an acronym. And this whole process is full of jargon that's even hard for the practitioners to understand. And there is public engagement, but it's not the kind of public engagement that we're used to with the city. It's not that just that different touch that we're used to having. So we get these numbers from the state, and then we have to figure out a way to allocate them. So what we normally do is just look at a few variables and do it that way. What we're not doing is looking at the entire region and like for the South Coast, that should include Ventura and elsewhere, and look where housing could actually be built to, where the economics make sense, where the constraints are considered. We don't get into that. So I think best done, we're actually doing regional housing planning. The way the state set it up is it gives these numbers to metropolitan planning organizations like SBCAG, and there's really no incentive for any city or county to take any of these numbers. It's all kind of liability, the way the city has the way the state has treated it. And a concern I have is with these large numbers, these have gotten significantly larger in cycle 6 statewide versus cycle 5. If these just can't be met, I'm concerned that people aren't going to try to build housing. If you can't win, why try? I mean, the city of Santa Barbara, we're intrinsically motivated to build housing, and I'm not concerned about that here, but it does lead to worse regional coordination. And then the last question: what about Ventura? So the way the state set up RHNA is we don't consider Ventura. Like, we stop looking past the county line. The reality is here in 2008, the voters approved Measure A, which approved widening the freeway. And the main reason for that was to accommodate commuters. So commuters, we have, I believe the last count was 11,000 commuters from Ventura to Santa Barbara County per year. And then we're getting a RHNA requirement from the state to the city of Santa Barbara. That's 8,000 to 10,000 units. Like, the state saying, where's the housing? Like, well, the voters said Ventura is okay for that. I mean, we see our coworkers spending a long time commuting, and we're wanting to lessen that. But the reality is, putting on my transportation hat, like widening freeways, this would be a 50% increase in capacity. You're going to have more people commuting. So I think what'll happen is more people will live in Ventura, and then the state will see, oh, there's more jobs in Santa Barbara. Where's your housing? And we can't say it's in Ventura because they don't let us say it's in Ventura. So we're kind of pointing in two directions, and there isn't a cohesive regional state housing policy, which is what we sorely need. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Really appreciate that. And it's very interesting to see how the city of Santa Barbara is grappling with such a huge issue. And now, from perhaps a more rural perspective, we're going to hear from DK, Dan Clement, from the County of Santa Barbara.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm glad all of you can join us for the Housing Coalition conference. My name's once again Dan Clement. I'm the Deputy Director of Long Range Planning for the Planning and Development Department for Santa Barbara County. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is the perspective on housing and the RHNA process from the county unincorporated perspective. With regard to that, slide 2, please. So why is the jobs housing imbalance so important for understanding housing and the RHNA process, and basically what not only the unincorporated county but the local jurisdictions have to contend with is that first of all, if you're concerned with the events that are going on in this world, that is the social and political events that are pretty much tearing up this country right now, you should be very, very concerned about the jobs housing imbalance, because it is arguably the largest structural cause for the regional and economic and racial segregation that exists within the Tri-Counties areas, which is causing, for example, migration on a daily basis, clogging up our freeways, and as we'll get into other adverse effects. And right now, it's very important for understanding what I kind of call the trifecta of planning, because it dominates so much of at least the work that we do in long-range planning right now. Indeed, it's probably, I'd guess, about 3/4 of the work that we're doing has to do with either housing, transportation, or climate change, because there's just that interconnected relationship between the three of those. So if you want to address, for example, reducing our GHG emissions, then you should be tripling down on jobs housing, such that we can locate housing in opportune areas where we can reduce commute and travel times. And then finally, just the quality of life for those who have to commute, it's lousy. Indeed, I lived it personally for on and off for about 6 years. There are long commutes. If you're a caregiver, such as if you're looking out for little ones, elderly or physically infirm, it's really nerve-wracking to be separated from those folks and have, for example, an emergency come up, and then you have to respond and say, oh, I'm going to be down there 25, 30 minutes, unless it's in rush hour traffic, you may have to stay hour plus. And then finally, to me at least, there's just something fundamentally unjust about a situation in which a worker, a laborer, is not afforded the opportunity to reside in the community in which he or she works. To me, that just doesn't sit well. At least that's not the community in which I would like to live. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges to the provision of housing? Knowing that it is a significant problem, why is it such a pain in the neck to get real good, particularly affordable and to very low and low income categories housing actualized in the county? Well, first off, as Mike explained in so many words, in general, the RHNA process only facilitates housing production, but it does not require or actualize housing production, except in some very limited exceptions. For example, we're seeing from the state now some penalties or repercussions if you are not meeting your RHNA targets, particularly for the low and very low income categories. And there are seeing some mandates, for example, for ministerial processing of applications that are submitted and are including a certain amount of this type of housing. So, but with the exception of that, once again, the RHNA process, we're zoning and setting things up to try to make others come in and create the housing, but we can't mandate it. And then second, the second issue, it's not unique to Santa Barbara County. I have found, for example, in my work, particularly when I was in the private sector and I got to work for various jurisdictions, that particularly amongst affluent jurisdictions, there seems to be a certain high level of engagement by particular groups, and unfortunately, many times what we see, and in Santa Barbara in particular, is things like racism, classism, and elitism masquerading as environmentalism. And I think why it's unique here in Santa Barbara County, it has something to go back to the oil spill and the history of here and environmentalism here in the county. And there's certain groups that forms a particular part of their identity. But unfortunately, that is a masquerade behind which there are other motivations which are trying to achieve what I believe are nefarious ends. And I hear that, for example, in the one-off conversations when I get the call from the property owner who's complaining about their next door neighbor, to conversations behind the scenes with decision makers. And unfortunately, that exists. But I have to say, it's unreasonable to expect our elected officials to make unpopular land use decisions, which might be very responsible decisions, but they're going to be unpopular because you have the mob, so to speak, right there in your hearing chambers telling you, if you vote for this affordable housing project, you will lose your seat come November. And it would be political suicide for an elected official when presented with that situation to make that decision. So don't expect electeds to step up and do that. And what's been very interesting too is that I'll have conversations behind the scenes in private with elected officials who have been in that situation and said, I really, really wanted that project. That was a good project for our district, but there's no way in hell I could have voted for that, because if so, it would have cost me my seat in the next election. So next slide, please. Okay, so this slide just provides a very, very simplistic diagram of what I've observed with regard to civic engagement on land use housing projects, and has been backed up by a lot of the research and literature. And what it demonstrates is, along the x-axis, you have a person's opinion of a project. That is the degree to which they support, in this case, an affordable housing project. And you can see on the left-hand side of the axis, you have those who strongly support to the project. And then as you move to the center of the x-axis, you have those who are indifferent about the project. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you can see those who are strongly opposed to the project. And then on the y-axis, what we're measuring there is the level of engagement. That is, who amongst these folks who have these different opinions about the project will engage in the process, the hearing process, and make their voice heard, so to speak. So what you can see is on the left-hand side of the spectrum, for those who strongly support the project, you will see a modest level of engagement. And particularly, you'll see applicants, developers, teams who will be very sophisticated, architects, engineers, business associates, others who will benefit from projects. You will see those folks come out. For those who are indifferent to the project, we don't see them, we don't hear them, and that's understandable. So, I mean, life's busy, it's got crazy with COVID, not to mention everything else with which we must deal today. So don't expect people, if they don't really have a strong opinion about a project, to show up in the hearing chambers. But unfortunately, those might be the most reasonable heads and most balanced opinions on a project, and unfortunately, they're not being heard. But what's most important about this diagram is what's occurring on the right-hand side of the spectrum with those who strongly oppose the project. Those are the folks that you will hear from when these projects are presented to the elected officials. And once again, it's unreasonable to expect an elected official to stand up to the mob, as Hannah Arendt famously called them. Next slide, please. So, Santa Barbara's housing crisis. So just continue with the challenges with the provision of housing. We in the unincorporated areas of the county are highly dependent on the cities for providing housing. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's just good planning to start with. And what I mean by that is it's good for reducing VMTs, that is vehicle miles traveled, as well as greenhouse gas emissions, which result from them. In the counties, I have to say, it's a different sort of paradigm from city or urban planning, in the sense that whereas in the cities, you're trying to bring in the development, bring on that tax revenue, build up. You want to go higher, denser. Yes, bring on. We got the infrastructure to support that development. We want to bring in tax revenue. That's great. In the county, it's different. You're trying to hold off many times what is the pressure of urban or suburban sprawl in an effort to conserve the unique resources that exist in those jurisdictions, for which human beings are not responsible for creating. So we got to manage those closely. And what I'm talking about there are things like our agricultural resources, our water, our natural resources, our habitat to support listed species. So it's a different ballgame for the unincorporated areas. And then with regard to the housing crisis, and trying to locate, at least in the unincorporated areas, those locations which are most opportune to facilitate housing production, we have few of those areas. That is, we have a few unincorporated urban areas. And then my final point here is a lot of this is already dictated or determined by state law. And that, for example, local agency formation commission, or LAFCO law, is really the driver for cities' annexations of unincorporated areas. We have no control over that in unincorporated areas. So that is really going to determine where and how annexations are going to occur and where we're going to see new housing production. Next slide, please. Okay, so where are we with regard to the RHNA cycle? That is currently in the fifth cycle. You can see the numbers here, and I know Michael summarized this earlier in his presentation. But the total RHNA, once again, was 11,000 units. That was both unincorporated and cities' responsibilities, of which the county unincorporated area was responsible for about 6% or 661 units. What we're anticipating for the next cycle is roughly a tripling of the RHNA. As Mike shared with you, we're looking at 29,313 units, of which the unincorporated county is likely to receive or be assigned to about 20 to 30%. And you can see the numbers there. It's roughly 5,500 to 8,600 new units. So we have our work to do here in unincorporated county. Next slide. Okay, so this slide just summarizes where we currently are with regard to our housing production in the current or fifth RHNA cycle. We're doing great on moderate and above moderate housing. Go county, yeah, as expected. That's not what we need here. What we need are the very low and low income housing being produced. And as you can see here, as highlighted in the red cell at the bottom, we are deficient by about 103 units at this point. Next slide, please. Okay, so what have we been doing besides just the rezone and land use changes which occurred when the housing element update was adopted for the current cycle? Other programs that were set forth in the housing element on which we have been working consists of, first off, our accessory dwelling units or ADU ordinances. We're on round 3. Thank you, state. That is definitely a job saver. But in all seriousness, yeah, we've been working very hard. We're now drafting our third ordinance. And also what we've been working on has been a relaxation to the permitting requirements for agricultural employee dwellings or AEDs. And those were recently adopted by the board. And as mentioned, it reduces the permitting requirements and changes the permitting structure, mainly in the coastal zone for how and where AEDs can occur on agriculturally designated lands. And then finally, although it is not something that the Planning and Development Department does, it's not something my group or team directly participates in, but the Community Services Department in the county is a very important entity for providing funding, particularly for affordable housing projects. With regard to the state housing and density bonus laws that the state has recently adopted, those have not really had a dramatic effect on the county unincorporated areas. And there's a number of reasons for that. First off, there were a lot of exceptions or carve-outs to those laws, which make a lot of the county unincorporated areas ineligible for projects to rely upon the state housing density bonus law to either fast-track their project or get greater densities. So, for example, some of the laws state that if you're in the coastal zone, the law doesn't apply. So right there, our entire coastal zone's out of the picture. So things like that occur. So we're not seeing a whole lot of them. We've seen a couple, but this is really an opportunity for, once again, the cities and urban areas to capitalize on. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pull out my 8-ball now and try to guesstimate what the future holds for the county unincorporated area. One thing I think we can count on is continued loss of local control. Thank you, City of Huntington Beach. That's all I have to say about that. Next point is that you will definitely see increased density in certain unincorporated areas. For example, we're definitely expecting it in the Isla Vista area, Eastern Gleta Valley, where there are those pockets of unincorporated area which are located next to, for example, multimodal forms of transportation. And then Carpinteria around the city, and then also what's not listed here in the North County, definitely around the Orcutt area. That area is already seeing a lot of growth, and I anticipate that to continue. I also expect to see the resurrection of the Isla Vista master plan that many of you know went down in flames a little while ago due to parking issues and disagreements between what some of the residents, Coastal Commission, and then different board entities wanted during the processing of that plan. But it is definitely needed. This is where I live. I'm not an NIMBY. I am an IMBY in my backyard, and I want to see more denser development, not only there, but then also in the city of Goleta, where I actually live. You're also going to see increased pressure to convert the existing urban agricultural lands, particularly the areas in Goleta Valley, along the Hollister Avenue, Patterson area, also in West Cart Valley. But as the last bullet indicates, there is a very important exception to consider with regard to the greenhouses in the West Cart Valley, and that's cannabis. Cannabis, at least in the immediate future, looks like it is so lucrative, it is going to enable the cut flower growers to remain in operation down there, albeit much more reliant upon cannabis as compared to the traditional cut flowers that they used to harvest. Next slide, please. Okay, just continuing along. Yeah, I'm anticipating there's going to be more state incentives for projects that further environmental and social justice issues that directly address climate change. And then I also anticipate more restrictions on how you can use existing housing. So for what I'm thinking here are vacation rentals. There are already a lot of restrictions that most jurisdictions have put into place. But for example, for us in the county, we're still dealing with our coastal short-term rental zoning regulations. What I would say, though, an exception to this would be in the coastal zone with regard to short-term rentals, because the Coastal Commission views short-term rentals as affordable accommodations for providing access to the coast. You will see more permissive regulations there as compared to our inland areas. And then also there is a big push right now for agritourism, and one component of that on which we're currently working are farm stays. So you will probably see those limited exceptions for accessory uses, but overall, yeah, we want to make sure that housing remains just that, housing for long-term housing. Next slide, please. All right, so Mike already did a good job of summarizing the key events with the RHNA process. Some of the highlights here I just want to point out that are important to us at the local unincorporated sub-regional level is that, yeah, in January, we're expecting to get our allocation finalized. And then in February, the working group's going to be in the public and HCD review of the proposed methodology. And then in April is a statutory deadline for SB-CAG to make their determination on how they're going to divvy up the units, so to speak. That is the RHNA methodology. And then in August of 2021, we're anticipating the RHNA plan adoption. And then that is really the time at which we, the county, and the cities are off and running to update our housing elements in accordance with the RHNA methodology. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. Once again, I'd just like to thank you very much for allowing me to join you at the workshop. And yeah, I hope everybody enjoys it as well. And I hope after COVID's over and we're back to times where we actually have the opportunity to meet in person, that I get the opportunity to meet all of you. Thank you once again.
Thank you, DK. That was great, really informative, and I appreciate you taking the time. Next, we're going to hear from Paavo Mankkonen from the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me at this event. I wish I was there in person, or we were all there in person. I guess the upside is I'm recording from a forest. So that's a different lifestyle we're living these days. My name is Paavo Mankkonen. I teach at UCLA. I study housing policy internationally, but increasingly I've been doing work on housing in California, the problems the state faces, and what can be done about it. I've actually been involved with the RHNA process in Southern California for the last year and a half, and I've been doing a couple of different research projects around RHNA reform and issues with zoning reform in California. I've also experienced the RHNA process, or am experiencing the RHNA process at the local level, with the City of Culver City's general plan update and the housing element update there. I'm on the advisory committee for the city. So I do want to shout out a couple of colleagues that I work with on these topics, Chris Elmendorf at UC Davis, Moira O'Neill at UC Berkeley, my colleagues at UCLA, Michael Lenz and Michael Manville. We have a couple of different published pieces on RHNA reform and issues around zoning in California. I did want to commend the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments staff for their really great work on the RHNA process there. I've seen the reports and they're really excellent, especially the historical perspective I like a lot. So I thought what would be most useful for me to present today is the statewide perspective on RHNA, not just kind of the RHNA process we have, but perhaps the one we should have and what hopefully we are moving towards at the state level. I think we all come at this from a different perspective. So I'd like to ask everyone to try to listen to this with an open mind, maybe take off your city government hat or county government hat and just listen from the perspective, perhaps of a state government, especially in a state that has had substantial economic growth, but anemic housing production, and has the problems of affordability that California does have. So I have some slides to outline the presentation. So first I'm going to talk about the problem. This is based on some research, especially at UCLA, that I've done. Then I'm going to talk about what the RHNA process is today and why it doesn't address the problem. I'm then going to go over a new approach that is kind of slowly becoming incorporated into HCD guidelines. It's really a different way to do housing element updates, but it percolates up into the regional allocation of housing as well. And I would encourage cities to use this approach in this cycle. Then I'm going to talk about some of what I think could be the physical changes in California that I think a visionary politician could be using right now to kind of shift some of the discussion to a more optimistic approach to kind of a new 21st century starter home for Californians, right? I think a lot of the politics of this is kind of reluctance to allow more housing production, but I think that's not the way we should be approaching this. We should be approaching this as kind of a necessary transformation of our cities and kind of how do we make it work for everybody. I'm going to talk about this shift in the approach to RHNA and then kind of what cities should be asking for, right? So the state government's asking more and more of cities, which I think is a good idea, but I think the cities are in conversation with the state and could be asking for more as well. So I have to start with this graph. You might have seen it before, but it's really just important to hammer home how much housing production has fallen in recent decades, right? So our boom production years recently are the trough production years of the 20th century, right? So we just used to build so much more housing in the state, and we've made it impossible to do so in many parts of the state, right? So this is kind of one of the roots of the problems, right? There are a number of different housing crises overlapping, but I think at the kind of root of many of the housing crises, we have this shortage. And it's not just a zoning problem everywhere, right? So we did this study where we added up the fifth cycle housing element. So in every city's housing element, they tell the state how much zoned capacity they have for new housing. So what we did is we looked in the fifth cycle housing elements and we added up every city and county's zoning capacity for the whole state. We got a number that's under 3 million units for the whole state, something like 2.8, which at the time, one of the headlines was that was not enough to meet Gavin Newsom's 3.5 million home goal. The more important takeaway from that study, I think, is that where we have zoned capacity in California is in places where there isn't a lot of demand for new housing, right? So the best example here, I think, is California City, which has, tons of entitled lots. I forgot the number, 50,000 homes that could be built tomorrow, right? But there just isn't demand for new housing in California City. Where we don't have zone capacity, unfortunately, is in the places with the highest demand. In some cases, this is because what was zoned for has been built out. In other cases, it's because the zone capacity has been down zoned, right? So there are fewer opportunities to build in these places where demand is highest. And that's kind of the root of the problem, right? We don't allow housing to be built where people would like to be living. So zoning, an important part of this is that cities don't build housing, right? This is often a refrain we hear, right? And it's true, cities don't build housing. Their main lever is preventing the building or housing or regulating what that housing looks like, right? So the RHNA process now is focused on zoning exclusively, right? So the cities have to report to the state how much zone capacity they have for new units, but it's really important to also understand kind of the role of zoning in what we call the production funnel in this piece on fourplexes that we wrote. So you need zoning in order to build housing, but you also need market demand, right? So in order to make it profitable to build that housing. So we have this assessment that we call the economic feasibility of building housing. But then if you have a place with zoning and with economic feasibility, you also need lots to turn over, developers to be able to acquire lots to build on, and that doesn't happen all at once, right? So this is a slow process, even in places with zoning and with economic feasibility. And then finally, at the bottom of the housing production funnel, you get the actual housing built. And I think this is an important kind of framework to think about RHNA in its present state, because you need to zone for many more units than you will actually see built, right? So if you have zone capacity for 100 units in a city, you're not going to get 100 units built tomorrow, right? You will get 100 units built if there is economic feasibility to build those units over a period of time as sites sell and developers build on them. I think a useful metaphor is college admissions, not just because I work at a college, but UCLA, for example, if they want a class of 10,000, they don't admit 10,000, right? They admit 20,000 or 15,000 in order to ensure that 10,000 show up at the door, right? So if we want 1,000 units built, we don't need to zone for 1,000. We need to zone for much more than 1,000. How much is a question, right? How much depends on the location and the market demand in an area. And that's something that I'll get into in the next slide. So this is a little bit more of a detailed analysis than the county level one I showed before. What I did here, this was part of the SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments RHNA discussion, where we looked at cities within the SCAG region. So of the 190-ish jurisdictions in the SCAG region, what were the rent levels in those cities? What was the zone capacity in those cities? And what was recent housing production in those cities? Kind of where was housing being built in the region? And I think this graph really shows kind of the problem and a potential solution. So what we see here kind of broken up into 25% of the population chunks of the region. Kind of on the left side, we see that cities where the rents are lowest have the most zoning capacity, and they also have the least housing production. On the far right side, we see cities where rents are the highest have the least zoning capacity, but nevertheless still have the highest housing production, right? So even in cities where there is very minimal zoned land available for housing production, you still see that land being built on. You have this negative correlation between where we have zoning space and where the production is happening. All right, so if this is the problem, right, we have too little zone capacity in the places where people most want to live. And we want to make actually building housing a goal, right? So as I see it, the current problem with the RHNA process is that the zone capacity is the goal rather than the housing production is the goal. And I think the big kind of shift in approach to RHNA that we need to take is making the actual housing production the goal. And this is slowly happening in the new HCD guidelines. This is addressed, and I think as RHNA reform continues, this will eventually be the way it shakes out. So if we want to make housing production the goal, one thing you might say initially is cities don't build housing, which is true. Developers build housing, and developers only build housing where they can make money, right? So we really need to focus on making zone capacity available in these high rent cities, right? Because then only then will we see kind of the levels of housing production we need. And the way to do that, I think, starts at the housing element update level and then percolates upward into the allocation of housing in the region. And so the simple idea here is called, well, maybe perhaps not so simple idea here is called expected development probability, right? So thinking about sites, not in terms of their total unit capacity when built, which is currently the way housing elements are structured, right? So you look at a parcel of land, you say, this can hold 100 units, therefore we're including it in our housing element as a site counting for 100 units, right? We should be looking at the expected yield over a time period. And this is a calculation we can make using development trends in the city, using characteristics of the parcel itself, right? Kind of projecting what would be the demand for housing on a specific site. You can do kind of more or less fancy versions of this expected yield calculation. And we have in this write-up and in other work, we have kind of different degrees of sophistication that cities could use or the state could use to do this. But the essential idea is that if a site, for example, in California City, has very little expected yield because it's very unlikely anyone would build there, it shouldn't be counted as part of the city's RHNA. On the other hand, if there's a site kind of in downtown Santa Monica where development is booming, then you would be able to count that for a greater expected yield. So the implication of this is that cities need to zone for many more times their RHNA targets, right, which they won't like. But more importantly, it's that they should be zoning strategically within their boundaries on sites where development is likely to happen. I think it has happened in the past that cities will put up vacant lots in their jurisdiction where development is very unlikely for a number of reasons. And then you have this RHNA process that is just paper and it's not actually yielding housing production. The good news about this approach, the development probability or expected yield approach to the RHNA process, is that the same principle would make the allocation across cities more equitable and more environmentally sustainable, right? So in the past, especially in Southern California, and I'm sure in other regions, we've seen kind of the opposite happen, where cities like Desert Hot Springs or Palm Springs or Coachella, right, in these desert cities where demand is not that high for housing, they get huge RHNA numbers. And cities where demand is very high, like Beverly Hills or Culver City in West LA, where there's a lot of jobs, got very low RHNA numbers. And this would not happen if we use the expected development probability approach, because at a regional level, if the region wanted to hit a target of 1 million housing units produced, they would definitely allocate more of those housing units to places where housing will be built, right? And the advantage of this is that it's more equitable and more environmentally sustainable in that it's often the rich cities near jobs where housing should be built, and where, in terms of equity, we should be pressuring cities to build more. It's also the cities near jobs where there is demand, and if we build more housing near where the jobs are, we'll have a more environmentally sustainable urban area. Okay, so moving on to kind of the visionary approach to selling this idea and making it happen. And another challenge in this process is bringing housing into what are, quote unquote, in planning terms, often called residential neighborhoods, right? So single family neighborhoods. One of the big problems with the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate in California is that many of the state's high opportunity neighborhoods are single family neighborhoods. And so it's difficult right now. There's not a model for bringing subsidized, deed-restricted, means-tested housing into these neighborhoods, right? So low-income housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods is the goal, but right now there's not a model for it. So I think we really need to explore options for how we can increase the housing availability in single-family neighborhoods and include affordable housing units in those developments. And I think there is a path forward through kind of 4-plex, 5-plex, 6-plex, kind of these small housing developments, perhaps in condo form, perhaps including 1 or 2 affordable units. The residential infill project of Portland, Oregon, I think is really exciting in this regard, where they have rezoned single-family neighborhoods for 4-plexes or 6-plexes if with affordability restrictions. So I think that this is, we can see structures like this not, quote unquote, destroying the look of a neighborhood, right? These are not towers. These are 2-3-story buildings that would fit in quite well with the neighborhood fabric. So what I'm calling I'm giving this idea away for free to any politician that'd like to take it up, right? So the 21st century starter home for California is something that I do think we need, right? So thinking about condos that would be much less expensive than the single family homes in that neighborhood, although they still might be more expensive than kind of build units in larger buildings, but nonetheless, they would be affordable to middle-class families. They'd increase the supply of housing near jobs in high-opportunity neighborhoods, and there would be potential for including affordable units in these high-opportunity neighborhoods that currently doesn't exist. So call me if you want to talk about it. Okay, so just to conclude, I do think cities should be pushing the state. I mean, I think one of the big problems with the RHNA framework currently, as many cities will point out, is that there isn't enough money for the low-income housing that RHNA places as housing need, right? So the state's, the supply of subsidies is much less than the need for subsidies in terms of low-income housing as mandated by the RHNA numbers. And I think this is a big problem we all need to focus on. I think that unfortunately, this is often used in bad faith by cities when they say, well, we don't want to do anything about building more housing in our city because there's not enough money for it, right? I think that unless a city is identifying lots, talking to nonprofit housing developers, setting up an inclusionary program, right, doing everything they can in order to get affordable housing built within their jurisdiction, this idea that there's not enough funding to build the affordable housing as mandated is often used kind of as a ruse. But they should be asking for more money. We should be developing a plan for building this housing. That's it. So I guess I want to just summarize by saying the current problem with RHNA is that it's treated kind of focused around having enough, quote unquote, zoning capacity And I think the focus needs to be shifted to actually building housing units and incorporating this idea of the probability of development of different sites in different cities, I think would get us to that goal. I think, we can do that currently with our current housing element updates at the city level. Cities can incorporate that in expected yield calculation into their realistic capacity calculations. I think they should. And, if I have a couple of publications on this topic, I'd be happy to talk about it with cities if they're interested in learning more. Thanks again for inviting me to this conference, and I wish we could all be having a happy hour. I heard the margarina as one of the cocktails proposed, and I have the Rena Colada as another idea. Thanks a lot, and have a good day.
Hello, guys. Thanks for coming back. I think we had some technical problems with our first time together, which is fine. And so we ended up all recording at separate times. I think we've all had a chance to watch each other, and now we're back to have a nice discussion. I thought it was necessary to explain, for instance, like why Pablo's not in a forest anymore, why Dan has this beautiful chair, and why we're all we're all in different locations and in different outfits. But I enjoyed all of your presentations, and I most recently just watched Pavo's and thought it was great. And so I'm excited to have this discussion with you all. As a reminder to everybody, we have Dan DK, Mike Becker, Dan Gullett, and Pavo. And I think I wanted to start off by asking Pavo, whether you think RHNA is a good process. Does it need a complete overhaul or just some tweaks? I think we heard a little bit about that in your presentation. Is it appropriate for coastal communities in particular? Should there be something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think that RHNA definitely needs tweaks. I think that the advantage of it versus statewide kind of zoning reform where the state chooses which parcels will be affected by upzoning or something. I think RHNA has the big advantage is that it lets the city kind of figure it out on its own. So it does preserve local control while giving some kind of expectations about growth. So in that sense, I think, it is a good framework. But yeah, I think as it currently exists, there are a lot of problems with it fulfilling its specific function.
Yeah. One of those tweaks that you talk about in your presentation and that I kind of wanted to pose to either Mike or Dan or DK is this idea of, instead of just the RHNA process planning for zoned capacity, that we in fact plan for, I think you call it expected yield or expected development possibility, that we should be really factoring in the economic viability, the likelihood of build, and those things into RHNA. And I kind of wanted to get either Mike Becker or DK, whoever wants to chime in, thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can try first. I think I take it as the state already assumes that to an extent, where if you look at historical numbers, nobody's building what they're supposed to or what their RHNA allocation is. So to an extent, the state probably already expects that no jurisdiction is going to satisfy RHNA 100%. And I think that's ultimately what is behind SB 828, is not necessarily going after the objectives of reducing overcrowding and reducing cost burden. I think, in my opinion, the true objective was just to make the number bigger. And in that respect, it was successful. And in recognition that 50% of 29,000 is bigger than 50% of 11,000.
Yeah, and just to tack on to what Mike contributed, yeah, it's one of those situations where, I mean, you can go ahead and plan for the 8-year period or whatever and set your target here, but knowing that realistically, you're never going to get that. So there's just kind of like a pragmatic approach to it. I like the idea and the concept because if you can kind of, I was kind of thinking of it as like overzone, knowing what's coming for a longer time frame beyond just that limited 8-year time frame. You might see a much more realistic housing production that will actually make a dent in the situation. So I like the concept.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it made a lot of sense. Papa, do you agree with Mike that the numbers are larger maybe because it's already sort of assumed that? Or I get that question a lot just from people that don't really know what RHNA is. And I think we get comments, honestly, a lot around here is like, oh, well, it's just a number. We don't actually have to build that much. And so I see that as a negative personally. I don't know. And maybe that's not the objective what RHNA is. And I kind of want to know your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it seems kind of silly to go through all this effort to plan for something that you also are saying we don't actually have to do this thing we're planning for, right? So I think that that's why aligning it with development probabilities makes a lot of sense in terms of like actually wanting to accomplish the goal you're setting yourself out for. In terms of this cycle's higher numbers, I mean, on the one hand, yes, it was a push just to get the numbers higher. On the other hand, I mean, I think if you added up all the Sixth Cycle regional determinations, it would still be something around 3.5 million units, which is what the governor was talking about actually building over the next 8 years, 10 years, right? So I think that, you know, if we're taking that seriously as a goal of production, then we shouldn't just think about it in terms of zoning for that much. Because I think like almost by definition, if you only have 3.5 million units zoned for, you won't build those, right? You're going to build fewer than that, almost guaranteed.
One thing that I'm not sure if I think maybe we touched on a little bit in the presentation, but that I was curious about, and I think this is maybe a question for Mike or somebody else wants to join in, but just how much does RHNA consider like socioeconomic imbalances and like racial inequalities that come from that? Does it deal with that issue at all? And are there ways that RHNA could help or have that as one of its goals if it doesn't?
Yeah, good question. And I saw Pavo shaking his head that I think he wants to crack at this too. But I think there are 5 objectives to RHNA. I could dig them up if you wanted real quick, but essentially they do seek to create economic parity among jurisdictions and to locate housing in high resourced areas. So that's baked in, and one of the changes that came with SB 828 is the state now has the role of reviewing a draft methodology to determine if it meets those objectives.
I think, Mike, you had just given a response about my question about the socioeconomic imbalances, and then let's see.
I would be curious if, I mean, does the city or county of Santa Barbara have a affirmatively furthering fair housing plan as part of the housing element update process contemplated?
This is Dan K. As of now, no, but it's definitely something that is definitely getting more attention. I would not be surprised if going forward, at least as part of this housing cycle, there will be efforts for that. And also, somewhat related, is that we are also going to have to embark on adopting an environmental justice element where we'll have to address some of those items. But I don't know if Dan Gullett has anything from the city's perspective.
My answer is the same. We haven't scoped out our housing element update yet, but I anticipate we'll be including fair housing and environmental justice as part of that.
So, Dan, as part of this process, obviously, is communicating with the community and getting the word out. Obviously, this next round is going to be a larger number than anyone's seen before, and you're going to have to try to implement policies. What do you see as like the biggest impediment or the most important piece about making sure that the community kind of gets on board with this concept, which I see as, you know, needing to, in certain ways, really plan for housing more than we have ever before?
Yeah, thank you. As part of my presentation, I mentioned, you know, the 2 big components of addressing what the city's obligations will be moving forward, and that they include a different approach to multi-unit housing and mixed-use housing. So like part of what you're asking is our outreach for that effort, and that'll be a big part of making our housing element work, and there will be outreach to different communities that'll be affected as part of that.
And then what about how much of it is like changing minds a little bit, like changing people's focus? Maybe what in our community has often been sort of a protection, no growth, NIMBY type. How do you, do you think that's the city's responsibility?
Absolutely. It's the city's responsibility. And we started that with conversations with Planning Commission and City Council, just presenting this new option for getting more housing by limiting the building sizes versus density. And then the state, on the other hand, is mandating that we allow for these accessory dwelling units, which is a lot of new zoning capacity that also let us achieve the capacity that's required under RHNA.
Great. Any thoughts on that, DK, before we move on, since you're also doing local from the county perspective?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One thing is to break down kind of the negative stereotypical image of multi-unit housing. And I think one example to point to is down in the downtown Santa Barbara area. If you walk just one block east, northwest from, for example, the courthouse building, you're going to get a great example of very eclectic, diverse types of housing. You will find 4-unit multi-residential next to a single-family dwelling, craftsman style, eclectic, and has that unique character. And we seem to accept it in that sort of environment, but introducing it into what have been historically single-family residential zones is kind of considered taboo for whatever reason. So we need to show those good examples of how it can be done correctly. For starters, another concept too that I keep pushing is that we have a bad habit of thinking in terms of what I call two-dimensional planning. That is, looking at things in a two-dimensional plane, such that if you need more, you always go outward on that two-dimensional plane. We got to think about more creatively, especially for the urban areas, is three-dimensional planning. That is going up. And at least for me, where I live, there would be very strong resistance amongst my neighbors to more dense housing. For me, I want it. And personally, I don't really care what's going on inside of the building so long as the effects of it don't spill out. So if you have 3, 4, 6 units, however, inside that building, I really don't care. I don't really care what you're doing. And that's the beauty of like form-based codes. They facilitate that sort of denser type of development. So we got to start showing those good examples of how things can work really well to break down those stereotypes and just break down the argument that's going to be presented when those good projects are presented to the decision makers.
So my next question, and it's for all of you really, are there, there's really SB 35 is one that comes to mind, and maybe there's another one of, I would say, like a stick, right? That if communities don't hit the RHNA, that they have, penalties, the land use planning, taken out of their hands, so to speak, so that the units get built. Do you agree with, SB 35 as a stick? Do you think there needs to be more? Is there a way that we can get jurisdictions to try to hit these numbers or actually produce housing without SB 35 or something similar? I will take it for whoever wants to just jump in and start talking.
I'll take that one. Yes, it's necessary. I mean, like I mentioned in my presentation, it's unrealistic to expect an elected official to be able to withstand the fallout from a very unpopular land use decision, which is actually very good for the community and providing for housing, particularly for very low and low income categories. So they need that cover. And that's a failure of our governmental institutions to be able to allow for a much more rational and thoughtful way of allowing locals to participate more in the process. So hate to say it, the more you fight, the more you're going to have your opportunity to play ball taken away from you. So,
yeah, I would just like to say that I think the structure that currently exists is what got us into the problem that we currently have. So it is necessary to mix up the structure, and SB 35 is a step in that direction, and I would fully expect more subsequent bills to keep chipping away at local control. Until we reach the other side of this crisis.
I maybe have a different perspective on SB 35. I think it's an unfortunate piece of governance where the state's changing the game on local jurisdiction. So it went from zoning capacity to production without us actually planning for it. In a way, we're getting production. And then, like, the local expectation is, oh, we're not meeting our RHNA numbers. And I hear from planning commissioners and architects, like, we should be ashamed of ourselves. We're not meeting these numbers. Well, one, that wasn't the agreement, and like we're trying to build housing here. So 95% of the state didn't meet last year's annualized number. So it's just like this array of law is, it's not producing what it's wanting. So just like, tripling the requirement isn't necessarily going to change the result. But I do expect Sacramento to take more control away from locals, pointing to us not meeting our numbers, which is unfortunate. I think there's better ways of having us all look at, like what you were talking about before, like where is it economically advantageous to provide the zoning to actually get production. And I really think we need to shift our focus into that rather than a paper exercise of getting zoning capacity.
I was about to say it's a boring panel when everyone agrees with each other. So it's glad there was one disagreement. But yeah, I mean, I think SB 35. I mean, I think it was a good bill, good law that's getting housing built. I think that the kind of the punishment, as it were, is not really that bad. I would like to see much more strict punishments if cities are not complying with their housing element or blocking housing from being built when the zoning is there for it. We've been trying to push this idea of some kind of receivership, local zoning receivership by HCD for cities that are kind of being willfully incompliant with what they're supposed to be doing under state law. I mean, I think that, this idea that we have so many discretionary reviews for multifamily projects is a big problem. I think that to the extent, I think Kleinman was mentioning it, to the extent that you take away the decision from the local elected, then they can say, well, it's not in my hands anymore, and they get kind of some political defense there. When it's their decision to approve or not approve a project, that causes a lot of problems, among others. Corruption, like in the city of LA, we saw kind of literal bags of cash being handed over for development approvals. And I think we can all agree that's a system nobody wants. So moving towards one where there's kind of programmatic rules that we set up for, the parcel is zoned in this way. If your project meets that zoning, you can get an entitlement, you can get it built. I think that's a better world.
So I think my general point is, like, SB 35, it's a Band-Aid on something that doesn't work. And I'd like something that works better for the whole state.
Sure. So one theme, I think, in a lot of the presentations was about funding, and sort of all these, these requirements, this uptick in housing, the need for affordable housing, and maybe there being sort of a lack, especially for localities, of the funds there, and whether that's an excuse or real. I don't know, but I mean, even with something like SB 35, if you have a zoning system that is completely pretty much discretionary, where there's nothing within a code that is much ministerial, that involves some planning. Like, how do you process an SB 35 application if it comes through? So in addressing RHNA and also producing housing so that you're not met with penalties like SB 35, how much is assistance from the state going to be funding-wise a factor to success? Anyone? Bueller. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, so some assistance is necessary. Like, the affordable housing doesn't produce itself. There's some ways of getting low and very low. getting moderate is hard, and it was hard for us to get inclusionary here at 10%, and we're just, as I said, we're not producing anywhere near the numbers that we need to. So we need more creative solutions. I think Sixth Cycle housing element will help us think of those, but in the end, what we do as local government is we set up the rules and the decision making procedures. Like we're not building housing, and there's limited ways of us to fund affordable housing.
So I know that maybe Mike had a question for Pavo, and I wanted to see if there was, a couple of questions that you guys had for each other, since you deal with this in a much more myopic way than I do. So Mike, if you want to ask Pavo your question, now would be the time.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. It actually goes to everybody, but recently I read the book Strong Towns, and if you haven't read it, I do highly recommend it. It takes more of a libertarian approach onto land use, and it basically talks about letting land live up to its full economic value, which, just as an example, in the neighborhood I'm living in, a single-family residential lot is probably $900,000 or $1 million. It doesn't make sense to buy that to build something on it. It never makes money off of it. But the point is, as for the Dan, as the city or the county rezones, is it a consideration for the economic feasibility of a development that you're zoning? Because the price of land is so high, you need a certain intensity of development. And then for Pavo, I know you talked about this in your presentation, but essentially, if you do increase the allowable intensity on a parcel to kind of make something economically viable to meet your set objective, I think lots of times that price difference is put into the price of land rather than something that would provide the developer some insurance that they could build something and make a profit, or at least not lose money. So, yeah, how much is it considered in local zoning? And then is there a way that you can allow intensity of development that's not just immediately sucked up by the price of the land?
Yeah, I can go first if that's okay. So the city of Santa Barbara actually undertook an economic study a couple of years ago to take a look at our average unit size density incentive program. And what it found was that the zoning in the heart of downtown would not produce any housing because it wasn't at a density that was high enough, because the land cost was too high to do that. So we actually just rezoned it, and that was effective last month. So we filled the donut hole downtown based on that information. So we did do it. It was kind of after the fact, and it's because the program was set up for an 8-year life to be reviewed during its life, and that's one of the things we looked at. So we did make changes based on that.
Yeah, I would say just for the unincorporated experience, not to that those considerations have not been dealt with to the extent they probably could have or should be. And it also just presents a lot of interesting questions too. And I just, for me, I pause when I'm presented with questions like these, because I mean, you have to get such an infusion of capital, I think, in order to really make that happen. I don't think it's very realistic, just coming off the top of my head. But I have not read that work, though, so I'm not intimately knowledgeable about it. I don't know if Pablo has anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about zoning shaping land value is important to understand, right? So, like in Westwood near UCLA, there's 20-story condo buildings next to single-family lots, and the land value is maybe 5 times, 10 times higher on the parcels that are zoned for multifamily than the ones that are zoned for single-family, just because the zoning restricts what you can do with it so much, right? So if you change the zoning on a single-family neighborhood, depending on its location, the land value will go up, right? But it'll only go up to the extent that developers are willing to pay for it, because they are able to build multifamily products that they can make more money on, right? So the important point, I think, is that the land value per house goes down the higher the zoning density is, right? So the land value kind of in an per square foot of land is going to go up a lot when you allow multifamily housing to be built somewhere, but not the land value per unit, right? So in single family neighborhoods, what we have is land that's really expensive for each house, and that indicates that it's kind of an inefficient use of land, right? So I think that, we can talk about land value capture tools and kind of ways that the city should think about getting some of the benefit when they change the zoning. I think there are a lot of opportunities there for municipal action, but I'm a big fan of the land value tax. I think property taxes and land taxes should be higher in California for sure. So it's part of a bigger set of policies that are also not ideal at the current moment.
All right, maybe one or two more, just the four of us, or four of us. I was counting Gavin there for a second. Do you have any questions for each other before I move on to my last question?
Yeah, I'm just curious from the city and county perspective, kind of, I guess you sort of already asked this in some way, Olivia, but kind of just what are the challenges you foresee? Like, do the numbers, the predicted numbers seem impossible to hit, or kind of how have you thought about it?
From the county's perspective, it's always an interesting dance because the areas in which we need to locate the density development that's necessary to really put a dent in the demand, they're few and far between. There are little pockets like in between the existing incorporated areas. It's possible to do it, but what's going to be the big challenge is, I think, for some residents here, they're going to have to kind of revision how they're branding themselves, so to speak. They're like, particularly with regard to what they want to see in the South Coast. And there have been, for example, ways to prevent certain, for example, agricultural areas to be converted. And I think the discussion needs to be had about whether or not that is viable going forward. And people just don't want to have that conversation because it gets to such like the core identity of what it means to be a Santa Barbaran. That's going to be very challenging for folks. The other thing which I already mentioned, like, for example, my neighbors, nobody wants the density of development that is really needed right here in my neighborhood to really make a dent in this in a way that makes sense given the goals of the Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. And then also what is challenging too is actually with entities like the Coastal Commission staff, they have a very particular idea of what constitutes true agriculture. So they're very resistant to policies which relax the permitting requirements, particularly for farm worker housing on agricultural lands. So that's a real challenge. But at least in our inland areas, we don't have that challenge. But then you have other things like the Williamson Act program, which limits the amount of accessory farm worker housing you can have. So those sorts of practical limitations or challenges will also come into play, as they do with every green cycle. But Dan probably has a different perspective from the city's urban areas.
Yeah, so the city has zoning capacity left over from cycle 5, and we were very conservative in cycle 5, so we provided more capacity than was required. So that, in addition to, like I mentioned before, the accessory dwelling units, and then moving away from regulating density to regulating building size, I'm confident we can do it. But it's just having that expectation of build out, I think, is hard. Like it's a difficult dialogue for the community. It's like, we're gonna increase in size by 25% in 8 years, or like we're not like either side. We're not producing it, or like it's coming. I think it's hard to moderate that.
So it kind of segues good into what was going to be my last comment. I think DK, you kind of touched on this, and I know Pava, you touched on this in your presentation, and we've talked about it too, Dan, about planning and outreach to the community. But this idea that really this cycle of RHNA is going to cause us to need to think of like in transformation, like we're a transformation of our communities. I think maybe is how you said it, Pablo. I probably butchered that, but just like a revisioning sort of how we live, what it looks like. What does it look like to have your first home? Maybe it doesn't look like a single family home on one lot, right? You're looking at something else. And how do you do that, right? How do you start changing that perspective of showing people a transformation? And then particularly to our community, are there certain areas where you're looking or thinking from a planning perspective where that could or may occur?
I think it's a really important discussion, especially with our electeds and those appointed people like our community people, just to understand what the zoning allows and what happens. We've seen in this community just reactions to buildings going up. We're very sensitive to small changes in our environment. So like the building at the corner of Chapala and Gutierrez, it used to be called Chapala 1, led to a height initiative. People were furious about that building, and I haven't heard anyone talk about that building in like 8 years. It's just part of the landscape now. So it's like it's this change. In some places it's more than incremental if you're going from a parking lot to a 4-story building, but I do think it's like, okay, this is what our zoning is providing for. This is what we need as a community, and just have like as many people understand that. And we have residents who are resistant to any change, and that's part of it. And these buildings are a lot of people. I acknowledge that, but it is like this emotional reaction to development that I think we need to be very careful about.
Yeah, it's just interesting how we are so resistant to change as human beings. But you can see that particularly in the case of land use. But I totally agree with what Dan said. And as mentioned earlier, yeah, a lot of this has to do with pointing to good examples of where it's worked and how it can be something really desirable. And I truly believe that because I've been in those communities where it has seemed to work out for everyone. And I think now more than ever, there is an opportunity when it comes to issues dealing with equity. So when you're talking about providing housing to very low and low income categories, this is a ripe political and social time to push that. So if there's ever a time to be able to justify why you should not be so adamantly opposed to that affordable housing project coming in down the corner, I think it's now. So that gives me a little bit of hope. I think that's positive. But yeah, we got to rethink our urban areas and what they're supposed to do for us, not only for those who reside in those areas, but what it's doing for everything functioning outside of those areas. That is, we can enable the farmers to continue farming. We can still have those absolutely stunning natural resources that we can recreate in and all that stuff. All of that only exists if we focus the density development in those urban areas. So we got to keep reinforcing those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. And the environment is the other thing, right? I mean, I think that, this is also the moment, if anything, if ever we want to talk about densifying in order to protect the environment and minimize greenhouse gas emissions is extremely important. So I think that, to me, it seems like the moment is ripe for visionary leadership. Like you need a charming leader to convince people that growth is important in certain parts of the city, and connected to, like this idea of the new starter home. I think that a lot of elderly people have this imagination of an endless California, like when they came here, perhaps, and there were suburbs, you could just build more and more suburbs. And I think it's increasingly clear that that's not true, but those people still would want to give young families today the opportunity to build equity by buying a house, and it'll just have to look a little different. But I'm optimistic that some people will come along and with this kind of vision, hopefully.
Well, I'm going to go out with one last recommendation, which is a documentary that I watched last night, if you all haven't seen it, which is with David Attenborough. His last, what he calls like his mission statement or his witness statement, I think he says. But I think, speaking to what Pava was saying, that now's the time to be thinking about not only housing, but greenhouse gases, the environment. And there's certainly an environmental reason, right, to be doing what the state's goals are in terms of housing people and housing them densely and in urban areas. And it's a really good documentary if you guys ever want to watch it, but it talks about biodiversity and sort of the importance of us focusing our attention on, getting our biodiversity back. And I think that has a lot to do with how we plan our communities. So I appreciate all of your time. It's been a lot of it, I know. So thank you so much. And until next time.